Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you're watching us on YouTube, you can catch us, take us with you on whatever fine podcast platforms you utilize. If you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, you can check us out in studio, see what we look like on YouTube. So go and check that out there. Leave a comment, mash down on that subscription button, let your friends know and your family members and your family members' friends know. These are my favorite kinds of conversations to have. As you all know, I'm a huge regulatory nerd. It's the area of public policy that I find most interesting. It's the one that I do the bulk of my work in. And I love having these kinds of conversations on the air. We've had him once before. He's one of our very few repeat guests, but I had to bring him back. His name is Wayne Cruz. He is the Fred L. Smith Fellow in Regulatory Studies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, of which I'm an alumnus. He focuses there on the impact of government regulation on free enterprise. His notable works include the annual 10,000 Commandments report, which is centered to what we're going to be talking about today. This assesses the federal regulatory burden and its economic implications. He has contributed to discussions on antitrust, competition policy, and various contemporary issues such as privacy and online security. Is an alumnus of the Cato Institute. He holds an MBA from my alma mater, the College of William & Mary, and a bachelor's degree from Lander College. And beyond his professional endeavors, Wayne is a father of five and enjoys activities like skateboarding and motorcycle riding. We're going to talk to him about that towards the end. Wayne, listen, let's just tee it up right here. The new edition of 10,000 Commandments is out. You guys have some slightly different measurements of the cost of regulation, but what does this year's edition of 10,000 Commandments show? Where are things standing with the regulatory state?
Yeah, so thank you a lot for having me, Andrew. You know how much I appreciate this and getting to talk about this. Regulations are the hidden tax. Somebody's got to track them. We try to do that. I've been doing this report now since the 90s, and this has been going on quite a long time. But the figure I use in terms, there are a lot of things to say about the regulatory state, but in terms of the costs of it, I use what I call a placeholder of $2 trillion. It's rooted largely in government figures for the cost of regulation. Back in 1999, there was something called the Regulatory Right to Know Act. And in keeping with the federal government not following its own laws, the federal government is supposed to perform an aggregate regulatory cost estimate. Back in those days, the estimate that OMB came up with ended up being around $1 trillion. And there are other costs that you can add to that. The National Association of Manufacturers last year did a regression analysis, which I don't do. I used to do regression analysis. Yeah. I don't do this anymore. But the National Association of Manufacturers came out with a $3 trillion estimate for regulatory costs. Right. Now you can go back and see academic studies that say no, the costs are $4 trillion and even beyond. I'm comfortable with using a $2 trillion placeholder, and I explain all of that in kind of a what comes after trillion narrative inside the report. And that encompasses, economic regulation, health and safety, paperwork, labor, environmental, all those sorts of categories that we ought to investigate when we talk about regulatory budgeting and things like that. But sometimes you need to break the pieces up, examine them a little bit separately. But the big picture of it this year, 2.1 trillion estimate. We finally were able to incorporate a new OMB report to Congress that was a catch-up edition, catching up 3 years of regulatory cost-benefit analyses and reports that it was supposed to do. So not only does OMB not do the aggregate estimate, just ignores that in the Regulatory Right to Know Act, it doesn't even do the annual estimate on time. And then on top of that, in the annual estimates, it used to provide a 10-year look back. That disappeared a few years ago. So we don't get that either. So, I called Biden the Edward Scissorhands of government disclosure and transparency after he came in with his modernizing regulatory review. But it's kind of a longstanding problem. Yeah, go ahead.
No. I mean, it's a situation in which what I was going to comment in, and you and I have had this conversation before, especially with the OMB's modernizing regulatory review, the executive order on that a year ago. But the last conversation you and I had was that, the Biden administration no longer cares about costs. The progressives no longer care about costs. All they care about is measuring benefits because they know they can make up those numbers. But talk about how that plays into all of this.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I want to say something about it because when I started this report in the 90s, and it had like a boring title like Regulatory Trends 1983 to 92 or something. And back in those days, when we were first discussing the regulatory state and central review of regulations for cost and benefits had first begun at the OMB, it was tied to the Paperwork Reduction Act even under Carter. And then with Reagan, Reagan extended OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at OMB's review of regulations in general. And the Unified Agenda, which is the twice yearly survey of agency priorities, began back in the 80s. And the interesting thing about it is it even applies to independent agencies. They even report that, they're usually left out of cost benefit analysis, but they do put their priorities allegedly in in the Unified Agenda.
Hold on, time out for a second.
Wait.
Let me interrupt you for a second. Do you, when CEI, when you do your number, do you include independent agencies in your cost calculations or no?
To the extent I can, and usually what that will be are older studies that looked, for example, at SEC regulatory costs. I'll try to incorporate something like that and footnote in. I did a working paper, and I probably should jump back on it because it would be good to update things but it was called Tip of the Costberg. On the invalidity of all regulatory cost estimates and the need to compile them anyway. Because I do want to caveat, we're not central planners. And so we don't think economic planning works. And the caveat to that is that a third party like us looking in, we can't tell what regulations cost either. We just say they have to do their best. They have to set cost caps, like simple, not complicated regulatory budgeting. And then the main thing is Congress has to be accountable for the regulations. But you were asking about the net benefit thing. Let me just say real quick about that. In the Ronald Reagan's executive order 12291 on regulatory review that kicked off what kind of the regime we have now for regulatory review, or at least the residue, the tailings that are left of it, because it's mostly gone. But Reagan's executive order said benefits should outweigh costs. Under Clinton, he replaced the executive order with 12866, which is kind of still operative now. Biden's modified it. And there it said benefits need only justify costs. And you saw the words equity start to pop in back in those days in the mid 90s. What Biden did the day he came in, he eliminated the Trump executive orders. It was on regulatory review, but Trump was notable for the 1 in, 2 out project, which was essentially a cost freeze. It was, if you add a significant regulation, then you need to eliminate at least 2 others. They don't have to be significant, but they don't have to be 2 others. And the result of it all has to be net zero regulatory costs. So that was the simplest version of a budget. And then, of course, he did some things we might touch on with respect to guidance documents that are important. But Biden eliminated all of that. Absolutely. With a memo called Modernizing Regulatory Review. Last year, his executive order came out of the same title, Modernizing Regulatory Review. And in it, the traditional threshold for which OMB would do a little bit of a deeper dive, to the extent you believe they did deep dives at all, would do a deeper dive into a regulation, was raised from $100 million in annual economic effects, could be up or down, but usually costly, to $200 million. So that was a big change in Biden's Modernizing Regulatory Review. But the emphasis there from the beginning, for the last 3.5 years, and you would read it in this Unified Agenda when you would read the preamble of his appointees at the OMB, Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Very, very, very steeped in progressive policy, not a regulatory watchdog function, but saying, we're going to use the regulatory enterprise and advance net benefits. Now, these are net benefits as progressives see them. This is not how people typically or necessarily think about things, because the progressive net benefits that they simply take for granted are climate crisis and net zero, are things like the Equity Project, the various competition policy programs, and you were talking about independent agencies like FTC, price controls in
Right.
that these agencies are implementing. A lot of that will be taking place with independent agencies, but he has enlisted OMB rather than it being a watchdog. It's now a cheerleader or a participant in the pursuit of progressive net benefits. So the watchdog function is gone. I had a chance to testify in Congress a couple of weeks ago, and one of the ways you might address that is
very envious. But yes, go ahead.
More resources for Congress to do what agencies don't do. But we might talk a little bit too about the problem of Congress is creating a lot of this itself now by disregarding enumerated powers.
Right. Let's stay with this modernizing regulatory view and also dovetail back into what you were talking about in terms of the executive orders. Folks, Wayne is the person, the scholar who coined the term regulatory dark matter, which is this idea that there are things that are outside the orbit of the normal regulatory practice that are governed by something called the Administrative Procedure Act. Right, the way a statute gets interpreted into becoming a regulation. And then increasingly, because that process can be very cumbersome insofar as it's designed to try to protect individuals' rights, right, and protect, the government from doing something stupid, it's cumbersome. And so rather than go through this process, agencies are increasingly relying on things like guidance documents and interpretation letters in order to do this, engage in the business of regulating without, dealing with the nuisance of a public notice and comment period. Biden comes into office, and in the first couple of weeks, if not in the first week, he gets rid of the executive order on regulatory transparency and accountability. And this, I guess this is part of my question, Wayne, getting back to 10,000 Commandments and tying this all together, because you have, I think it's Advancing American Freedom, which says that the regulatory costs have jumped up by about $1.5 trillion in the first 3.5 years, which means that the regulatory state has grown by about 15%, 16% annually since Biden took office. That makes sense to me, given the tempo with which regulations are coming out. So, we talk about the 1 and 2 out and the regulatory constancy, and then taking a drive up. How does all of this square together with the getting rid of the executive orders on transparency and accountability, the changing posture and tempo? How does this play into increased regulatory cost in the last 3.5 years?
A lot has happened. When you mentioned regulatory dark matter, that kind of is rooted in a project we had at CEI a few years back when we were talking about executive branch overreach. Common theme you hear in the conservative libertarian community. There's also a lot of congressional overreach, but it was executive overreach. And so, we had President Obama at the time saying, I've got a pen, I've got a phone. If Congress doesn't act, I'm going to go around Congress. And so it got me to thinking and cataloging the ways that the federal government would go around the regulatory process. Not a law, not even a notice and comment regulation, of which there are about 3,000 every year, but to use guidance, notices, circulars, bulletins, interpretations, memoranda, letters, all these ways of working around. And we took to calling that regulatory dark matter and cataloging it. Interesting thing, Andrew, is when I did the first inventory, I called it Mapping Washington's Lawlessness. I could only come up with a few thousand of these things. I could only find, we knew they were out there, but you couldn't find them. Which
is the nature of dark matter, obviously.
Yes, exactly. And so we pushed that notion, and we ended up, there ended up being legislation introduced called the Guidance Out of Darkness Act that is not enacted yet, but it's been passed in the House before, but it never made it all the way through. But also Trump did his executive order on guidance document transparency and required that all of these guidance documents be put in a portal. And so when that was implemented, it was very near the end of his term when that happened. Agencies started doing it, not only posting their guidance documents for all the dark matter on portals on their websites. I thought it should be a central portal, but the agencies were doing it on their own.
Sure, yes.
You take what you can get. And so anyway, he also instructed agencies at the same time to write literally notice and comment rules on fairness for guidance documents. And by my tally, and I included it in the new edition of 10,000 Commandments, so there were 33 agencies that had issued these final rules on guidance, and I nicknamed them frogs. And then when Biden came in and did his scissor hands job, the agency started deleting them. And now there have been 22 frogs stomped. The other ones haven't necessarily gotten around. They probably don't even necessarily need to, but the portals are gone. The final rules on guidance, public protections are gone. Yet when I did a circle back under Trump, I got around 113,000 guidance documents, which was just staggering compared to what we were able to determine before. Now with Biden eliminating the portals, I can still count 107. That's what it was last year. I'll be updating it again this year. Yeah. But the interesting thing about this is that small change made a big difference. And now, even though Biden's eliminated, you could still find this stuff, at least for the time being. But the only reason you could find it is because of what Trump did. So the guidance documents matter that way. And it's going to make a big difference in coming days, months, years, because in the wake of Chevron, we might talk about this, but I think the Chevron deference, the demise of Chevron deference with respect to allowing agencies or giving agencies leeway with regard to their interpretations of ambiguity in statutes is going to make the left get even more creative than it is now. That's one thing I think we have to watch out for.
So it's a good way to open that up, because one of the things that drives me up the wall in the wake of the post-Loper Bright and Relentless decisions is this moaning and wailing and gnashing of teeth as though the agencies can no longer engage in interpretation, which they can do both, under their existing constitutional mandate, and then also within the framework of what they call the Auer Doctrine, which is, folks, for the uninitiated, that's the deference that's given to agencies in terms of how they interpret their own regulations, right? Chevron is how they interpret statutes. They can still interpret statutes. What it means is you can't have any old crazy thing. You can't say that a dry patch of desert sand in the high desert of Nevada is a navigable water of the United States. You actually have to, and it makes it easier for a court to say, that's not what Congress intended when they passed the Clean Water Act and said you can't pollute a navigable water of the United States. It actually has to be a navigable water of the United States. So, but I guess sorry, go ahead. The point is the agencies can still regulate, Wayne. It's just that there has to be some return to common sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, there needs to be common sense, because what you just said about the waters of the United States, our former general counsel, Sam Kasman, said that it was moistures of the United States that the agencies had decided that they were regulating, and that's what they're doing. So it makes sense if you think agency regulation is the right way to go about something, and it's not always the case that is, but it needs to be rooted in statute. The concern I have now in the wake of Chevron, though, is, it was 40 years that Chevron was in effect. A lot of the back in the 80s, a lot of the administrative state was erected before then. We had the APA, we had the New Deal agencies, we had Department of Energy, EPA. All of these agencies elected prior to Chevron. They're already still there, and we already have Congress. These things like that drive people crazy, like the energy efficiency standards, those are rooted in Congress's laws. And in the wake of CARES Act, American Rescue Plan, inflation law, infrastructure law, CHIPS and Science law, I think the left will look at the Chevron decision and say, wow, look at the big stuff we were able to get done there without having to worry about agency interpretation, because those things are they're statutes, they're spending, but they're hyper regulatory before an administrator picks up a pen. That's what I'm thinking. So I think they're going to watch, and you mark my words, they will take lessons from what they achieved then. They'll take lessons from things like the TikTok ban. They'll take lessons from things like looking last week at the Senate working through this child online protection law, and they will get the big things done just by making the statutes a little bit less ambiguous.
Right. Let me ask you this, because I don't think you and I have ever talked about this before, but since we're talking about the administrative law, where are you in this whole situation? You've got, I think it's Philip Hamburger up at Columbia, who is not a fan of the Administrative Procedure Act. I actually like the APA because of its deliberative nature, because it takes time and it makes you sort of look at these things. Where are you in all this? What are your thoughts about the usefulness of the Administrative Procedure Act and whether or not we should abandon it? Obviously, I think we both agree the administrative state is far too big and far too powerful. Yeah. But I think that the APA constrains it as much as it empowers it.
Yeah. I made a little funny cartoon one time. It was like a beach. It was a giant beach with the sand, and it said administrative state all across the
Yes.
sand. And then I had a little sandbox sitting in the middle with a little shovel going out and said GOP regulatory reforms.
That's
And
so funny. Yeah.
sometimes we're playing in a sandbox on the left's administrative state beach, and we have to be
Yes.
careful about that. And so just with that caveat, I would say, yes, the APA can be protected. But remember, it was created after a lot of these agencies were reformed.
Sure.
It was created after the FTC, after the antitrust laws, kind of after the sort of the original sins of the administrative state that we got back in the 1900s. And you can argue it both ways. And I do argue both ways because I do favor tweaks to the APA,
Of course.
that make things better. But
Right.
you have to be careful because, like, even in the Chevron decision, in the dissent, which made the big point that agencies are expert, and that's why this is a bad decision. I disagree that they're always expert.
Right.
And at the same time, in the majority opinion, they also agreed that agencies were expert and that they could still do these things. So there's a little bit of a notion of what I would say is there's still too much credit given
Sure.
to the administrative state, even in some of the new decisions. And we just need to be on guard.
Part of my point in all of this is if the APA wasn't as powerful as it is, then the agencies would not be doing whatever they can to try to avoid the APA process, right? And then
Right.
so part of it is one of the tweaks that needs to be made is that, anytime an agency is getting out there, it gets into the work that you're doing and Jessica Malugin is doing and other folks at CEI are doing on this idea of making sure that these agencies are held accountable so that individual rights are protected, right? One of the things, I don't know if I've ever told you this story, but one of the very first cases I worked on when I was working for a blind environmental attorney, we've had him on the show before, was a situation in which a major chemical company that had a chemical process in which a particular chemical was used and it was recycled. So they weren't consuming it. It was being recycled. And they'd been told that the NESHAP, the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, did not apply to this process because they weren't actually emitting anything. None of the chemical was being consumed. There was no process there. And the EPA changed the interpretation on this company and then pursued them criminally under the new interpretation. And that struck me because it had not gone through the same kind of rigorous, APA process of vetting. It was merely a change, and the idea that they're going after them criminally, which, again, to tie it into the work that CEI is doing on these administrative agencies and how they stack the law against people they're pursuing. You're absolutely right. It's an issue in which there are powers. The powers are vast. Power that is vast is easily abused. We need to be finding more ways to rein in that power. But talk about that issue.
Well, yeah, I think the protections that are built in are important. And even, for example, when Trump did the guidance document portals, and then he required the rules alongside, those were ways of using APA and other protections to do more. He did the same thing back with economic deregulation notions late in his term after the pandemic, in freeing up the economy. And even when he first came out with the guidance executive order, there was actually a secondary order with regard to the judicial process and protect. He had all these landowners and others behind him, who were being hurt by regulations. So all that's really important. And also the APA does have provisions for more formal rulemaking. Where there's hearings and much more complexity. That those kinds of things I think could be used to enhance the process a little bit.
Yeah, it's a situation in which the American public is enhanced by having greater analysis, and I know some folks call it paralysis by analysis. But when we talk about this, because looking forward at, and again, your organization is not a political organization. But you are looking at the different policies that different folks are ascribing. We know that under one candidate, we get, a continuation, if not a continued acceleration. Again, my numbers show that we're growing by about 16% per year in regulatory costs. If we continue down that road, that means according to at least if the Advancing American Freedom data is to be believed, a $7.5 trillion regulatory state by 2030.
Yeah.
Which is, but even keeping it at a $3.6 trillion or $4 trillion regulatory state, or even a $2 trillion regulatory state is massive. Talk about the difference in these postures and what it means for the economy overall, Wayne.
Well, the costs of regulation are a lot like taxation. They say that these are imposed on companies, but regulations are like a hidden tax, and like taxes on companies, they also trickle down to the individual and the household. In the report I have, I say, okay, it's close to $16,000 a year that the average household is hit with on the regulatory side. That's bigger than everything in the budget except for housing. It's bigger than transportation, bigger than all your clothing, bigger than food. So it's huge amounts of money, but that's one of the problems with the regulatory state, that everything is hidden,
Right, and you can't get down to it. It's so funny. That's why the real stories and talking about the ancillary impacts, it's and also dispelling the myths. I spent a lot of time on the radio a couple of weeks ago talking about this. They had one of the political groups did a massive seminar with thousands of people, and a woman came on and in a very patronizing way denied, actually, I guess this was a TikTok she had done beforehand, in a patronizing way, denied that there was an effort to ban gas stoves. Nobody wants to take your gas stove. We just want to put a little sticker on your gas stove. And that's not true. But then I don't know if I told you the story. So I'm walking my dogs one day, Wayne. And again, we talk about the unintended consequences of regulation. And I'm walking them in my neighborhood, and I hear what sounds like a whole home generator come on. And I look over, and sure enough, somebody's generator has come on. And I realize that it's gas fed, natural gas fed, because natural gas is a dumb technology. When I say dumb, I don't mean that it's smart or stupid. I mean that it just does what it does. You just literally pressure and gravity bring the gas to your house. You don't have to do anything except turn a valve, right? But you need the infrastructure in place. I know it's a little more complicated than that, but set that aside for a minute. But the point is, if you get rid of gas stoves in people's houses, then they don't have the infrastructure to run a gas line. There's no gas line running to their house. So nobody gets the whole home generator to use in an emergency. And so all of a sudden you're dealing with all these folks. And this when CI would produce great videos of people being forced to ride bicycles in snowstorms. There's a real world impact to all of this, that we are better at telling stories. $16,000 per family is a great statistic, but I don't know. I guess we need to be better at translating that into real stories, and you guys are good at that. But talk about that a little bit.
When I say that I think the costs of regulations are greater than $15,000 a household, I really mean it. I feel like, as you described, for example, the dumb gas issue, it makes me think of all of the technologies, all of the frontier areas where government has preempted, born captive is how some refer to the notion of new innovations and new evolution. Our Fred Smith would always say that, the progressives were very, very smart. Anything that was in government hands prior to the turn of the century, not this one, but the last one, airsheds, watersheds, so forth, spectrum, remains in government hands, remains regulated. And something like a gas stove and that line to the home, that really gets to me, because you might have heard me talking about this notion of like a splinter net. When we talk about internet regulation and there's one size fits all rules that everybody tries to pin down. And I always said, no, we need duplicate, redundant networks all over for security reasons, kind of an internet in everybody's backyard. Right. And so whether you're talking about gas lines, these EV charging stations, 5G cell pods, new kinds of technologies, all of these areas, the gas line to the house and everything, these companies should be working together on new forms of property rights under capitalism, new kinds of rights of way development. This is why I said that a little bit earlier about agencies not being experts. Expertise involves taking those resources that have been put in government hands and moving them into the voluntary sector. And my joke version of that was a few years ago, we threw drones, which drones was a big issue a few years ago. It was nanotechnology a few years before that. Now it's AI. But drones were thrown into 80-year-old airspace law, when in reality, given the new technologies that are there, because market failure is the justification for regulation, but technology eliminates market failure. So you could theoretically, and this is partly tongue in cheek, but you could pack the sky like a neutron star with drone corridors for drones to fly in separate from each other. But instead, everything is thrown into the public airspace. It's the same thing, Andrew, with something even like the gas lines you're talking about. They should all be working together to expand rights of way. But instead, you got sewer, water, electricity, telecommunications, transportation. All of these industries are siloed by the administrative state, and the silos need to be broken down.
You know, it's interesting you say that because it's 2024, almost 2025. We're up on an election, and we should be able to do things better and more smartly to sort of deal with these problems. And yet we are, it's like the issue of crypto, right? Not that we necessarily need to spend a lot of time talking about cryptocurrency, but, you know, but you have the SEC jump the gun wanting to regulate crypto through litigation. You have the CFTC that wants to jump in there. You've got the Treasury Department that wants to jump in there. Everybody wants their piece. And what they fail to realize is that it is something entirely different. It has aspects of a security, but it has aspects of a commodity and aspects of a currency. And so trying to tie it into the existing regime doesn't necessarily work. I mean, we need to be much more fleet of foot. And not that I want the private sector to be doing the regulating because that leads to cronyism, sort of, and guild protectionism. But there's got to be better ways to do this. Sorry, go ahead, Wayne.
Yeah, actually, look, you hit on something really important there when you said the different agencies pulling in. That is now somewhat of an explicit policy. When we were talking earlier about Biden's whole of government approaches in the past, but when you brought up modernizing regulatory review and all of that, a big part of it, and you can see this in his public statements, in the White House daily briefing statements, often when Biden would travel around the country talking about the CHIPS law and how he's handing out all this money with strings attached, everything would be couched in whole of government approaches. There's a whole of government approach to the climate crisis, whole of government approach to, you know, what you just talked about with respect to gas and, you know, this net zero campaign, whole of government with equity. All the agencies have got to come out with these equity plans. And what I see is you can now eliminate an agency, but given the whole of government philosophy and given the OMB's net benefit pursuits, the campaign would continue. So you would have the FTC come out, but you would also get Merrick Garland out there from Justice, and then you would get the Department of Agriculture, you get Vilsack out there, all of them talking about price controls. Each one looking for ways to regulate and affect prices. Same thing with the notion of, you know, you have to say it with a reverent tremble, I guess, supply chains. You know, everybody wants to interfere in the supply chain. And so Biden has issued this executive order that it unfortunately got overlooked. I wrote a piece in Forbes about it late last year. There are certain new little checkpoints coming about of where the different agencies are all coming out with their whole of government supply chain notion. And guess what? They've got a big fat report coming out after the election that's going to have probably ridiculous stipulations that they get agencies to do, knowing that even if they lose the election, the next president, if he were to be not Kamala Harris, would continue those new interventions, the same way with equity and so forth. So they advance these things whole of government style in such a way that a new president will find it very, very difficult to roll any of it back.
And also outside organizations, right? This gets into the more sort of strategic way because, you know, we look at it, you're absolutely right. Because I talk about this, people are like, you know, you're crazy, whole of government approach sounds very conspiracy thing. I talk about religious freedom, right? You've got HHS doing one thing. You've got the Department of Education doing something else. You have the United States Department of the Interior, the National Park Service, removing a statue of William Penn from the William Penn homestead, all part of this, to me, attack on religious freedom. And the bottom line here is, when you get an organization, a great organization like CEI, and CEI is a vigorous regulatory practice, but they may not be able to look at everything in every agency. So they might, know, okay, well, ESG is happening at EPA, it's happening at the SEC, but they may not know that it's happening at, I don't know, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology. We were working on an IP issue having to do with intellectual property and intellectual property rights in pharmaceuticals. The National Institutes for Standards and Technology is weighing in on price controls. That's the whole of government approach. And it becomes, right? I mean, I don't know if you follow this, Wayne, but essentially there's a couple of obscure scholars who for 25 years have been trying to get the ability, make sure the federal government has the power that if they determine that a pharmaceutical or any device that was developed with a small amount of government grant money, is seed money, if they determine that a drug, its price is too high, well, then the federal government can come in and seize that patent. That's the whole of government approach here. It is incredibly dangerous. I'm sorry, I know I interrupted there. Go ahead.
Well, no, you didn't interrupt me, but you raise a point where when we talked about laws, rules, and dark matter, we jumped over something that you just hit that I think is important to note. And that is the gigantic subsidy and loan guarantee and contracting and procurement state that we exist under now. That is the real machine that's enabling tomorrow's regulatory state. Because when the things you mentioned about the ESG reports, different agencies are doing them. Different agencies are doing environmental justice. They've got reports on it. They're baking this stuff in. They're hiring staff to do this stuff such that when a new administration potentially comes in, they're not going to be able to get rid of them. They might just change the names of what the staffs do. But there was for example, there was a CRS, a Congressional Research Service report that came out in 2019. Massive amounts, over $700 billion annually in block grants to states. Now, people talk about, we turn everything in block grant, give it back to state. What I'm warning about is don't have the federal government, leave it in the states in the first place and let them do these things, because what's happening now is you might have noted the little tidbit in 10,000 Commandments where I'd said you mentioned the major roles and economically significant. We're starting to see an uptick for state and local government. We're starting to see an uptick for small business. Those things are happening, but a lot of it is them being seduced by federal government money. We mentioned CARES and CHIPS and inflation and all these laws. I already said they're huge spending, but they're also hyper regulatory. They're showering out this money. So where we had a constituency for regulatory reform in the 90s over unfunded mandates, and you'd have the small business and state and local getting together to put a stop to this, we don't have that now. You know why? Because funded. The mandates are funded. Yes. They're funded mandates. And, as it goes, something can't go on forever. It'll stop. They can't keep funding it forever. But right now, everybody's being pacified. When you would see Kamala Harris at these state and local, these governors events back earlier this year, they would all be talking about how awesome it is that they're working with the federal government to get money, and they're implementing the Biden administration's environmental agenda and climate agenda and equity agenda and competition policy and union labor and all of these things that they're baking in. So they don't necessarily have to write a rule anymore when they're handing out billions and billions of dollars. Right. Instead, you have to apply for that money, and you have to answer what's called a notice of funding opportunity. And what do companies, what are they induced to do? They have to promise to do all of these progressive add-ons and bake it in order to get the cash. Ted Cruz, by the way, has been really good at pointing that out with respect to broadband, but it applies all over.
Yeah, add into this when you get to the municipal level, right, the county and town level of things, city level of things, and you get these municipalities buying their regulatory codes from international standard setting organizations, and they're just buying them and implementing them wholesale. So if they're if the progressives, the statist progressives, are out there influencing these standard setting organizations, they're changing the law, and you buy it, you can't do anything about it. It's crazy. Wayne, let me go back to something we were talking about before I let you go. I got a couple of things I want to ask you. So we had the Loper Bright relentless decisions. Chevron deference is overturned. We have stipulated now that agencies still have the power to interpret statutes. You have this hue and cry from people like Elizabeth Warren, who has put out this Stop Corporate Capture Act. And among other things that it does, it's about sort of restoring the concept of deference, which is insane. I want to talk about that sort of giving up of the power. But it's also this weird thing where we have the Congressional Review Act, which says that if you have a major rule and it can be challenged, if someone thinks that it's not the right interpretation, Congress can, put their stamp down and say, no, you can't do this. Elizabeth Warren's Stop Corporate Capture Act says, no. Even if Congress decides, we want to give these agencies the power to veto what Congress has done. Your thoughts here about this? All of this law is supposed to come from statute. Congress, part of the reason why we're in this mess is because Congress has given this stuff up. I know you talked about the specificity here, but this is insane.
Well, she's basically proposing an amendment to the Constitution, as I understand it, because Congress is the one with the lawmaking power, and at least we have a little bit of an affirmation of that. The interesting thing about her putting it in context of the Congressional Review Act is, while that was one of the most important affirmations of the notion of legislative power residing with Congress, it was up until Trump, it had only been used one time.
Right.
And then with Trump, it kicked up well over a dozen. And I would imagine, and especially given the uptick in significant rules that Biden has recently done, and that apparently he's continuing to do them despite their being subject to overturn next year by CRA, it's been difficult to use it to actually deregulate. So she would have a hard time moving that through. And plus, the offset to that is that she's not really on the gas pedal with it in terms of what regulatory reforms are all about, because the leading vehicle, of course, is the REINS Act, which would say Congress doesn't have to get up on its hind legs and veto something in order for something that's big. And I say they need to also add the phrase controversial, but in order for something big and controversial to go through, Congress needs to affirm it, not get up on its hind legs to revoke it. And I remind folks, when I had the chance talking on C-SPAN earlier today, it was leading the charge on the Congressional Review Act on the CRA was Harry Reid of Nevada. I mean, it's unthinkable now that you would have Democrats doing that. But as Warren tries to pursue this, what I'd be impelled to do is go back and look at what Democrats were saying about executive overreach and making sure that Congress held on to the authority that it merits. But I think she's going to have difficulty with that kind of approach. But it's not surprising that progressives do that, because they go way out with the legislative proposals and the regulatory proposals. So they're not ashamed, they're not bashful about proposing any of these things, but it requires a unity to stomp it down.
Yeah, they don't pre-negotiate against themselves. Wayne, before I let you go, because you've been very generous with your time. So you're avid motorcyclist. You go anywhere fun recently over the summer? Anywhere, or are you getting ready to go anywhere?
Yeah, when Dad died, he was on his third Harley. He didn't die on the Harley, but he was on his third Harley and his third wife. So he got me started riding a few years back. So what I do is, ride around here, of course, but we would go to Myrtle Beach. Just has a terrific bike week at Myrtle's Inlet, and you just have thousands and thousands of bikers there. So Dad and I went, and then now my uncle and I go. And then my father's best friend. So we head down to that. So we had the spring bike week coming up in end of September, 1st of October is going to be the fall bike week. So we'll be headed back there. But it's just a nice way to get in and out to DC and to have a little fun. Very cool.
Yeah, and CEI dinner's coming up. The aforementioned Jessica Malugin, Mistress of Ceremonies this year. It's what is it? Which anniversary is this for CEI? Which anniversary is it?
This is going to be 40th. This is going to be, I should have said that at the very beginning. This is going to be the 40th anniversary. So, Fred would always say, founded in George Orwell's year.
Yes, I need to get, I'll need to get Kent on to do a special CEI 40th anniversary kind of a thing. See if I thought about that, because I want to come back and MC again. I'll be shameless about that here.
Oh yeah. Well, listen, I just want to say, as you're kind of wrapping up, we always leave things on a positive note, and I think, we always say that most of the wealth is not created yet, and most of the, and so we don't have to regulate in the future the way we have in the past. So as you think through these things and the implications of seemingly small things, like what you were saying about just a gas line to the house, there are lots of infrastructures and lots of rights of ways and lots of property rights that are essential in a free and a libertarian, free enterprise society. So there's a lot we have to do, and we tend to default to regulation right away. And we see that now. How you mentioned crypto, and we see it happening with artificial intelligence. And I think it's up to us to have better plans to wall off the future from the administrative state. And that kind of wraps it up.
Listen, all I know is I don't know much about the AI regulation. What I know is, if there's going to be any law, it's that you can't have AI robots with some kind of weapon on them. That's the only thing.
There you go.
That'll just go bad. That's a bad idea. That's beyond that. I'm not. Wayne, thank you so very much for joining us today.
As always, absolutely my pleasure. And we ought to get back on here and talk about regulatory dark matter when I do a new inventory.
We have to do that. So my guest has been Clyde Wayne Cruz. He's the Fred L. Smith Fellow in Regulation at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. You can go find them at CEI.org, celebrating their 40th anniversary this year. I'm Andrew Langer, and as I've said, this is the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Go and please leave a like, leave a subscription. If you're watching us on YouTube, go and check us out on those fine podcast platforms. And likewise, if you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, go check us out on YouTube. Have a great week, everybody, and please enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.